One of the things that came up in our previous discussion on critical minerals was the need for greater South-South cooperation and how much the lessons from one geography are actually applicable more widely. One of the things about having a discussion such as the Kigali Global Dialogue in Rwanda, organized in part with Indian partners, is precisely to encourage that thinking. And today, the fact is that there are many success stories across the global south and beyond where these lessons are applicable across geographies. And today, I hope we can use the next 50 minutes or so to go into some of those discussions and learn about what, some of the exciting developments and innovative solutions being found in many different places. I have a really excellent panel, and they were introduced, but I'll just briefly introduce them. A really excellent panel to discuss these topics. To my immediate right is Deborah Lamb. She's with Georgia Tech. She comes from the academic world, but she's also founding executive director for Partnership for Inclusive Innovation, and she'll speak a little bit about what she is doing in that capacity. Nancy Mwange joins us from Kenya, Deputy Director of the Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis. She's trained as an economist, and will speak a little bit about some of the very innovative developments in Kenya's economy. Arvind Gupta, actually far right, I'm jumping a little bit here. You've heard from already. He moderated an excellent panel yesterday. He's the head and co-founder of Digital India Foundation in India. And Tariq Karim, it's a pleasure to see him again after many years. He's the director for Center for Bay of Bengal Studies in Bangladesh. Let me start by turning to Nancy Mwange. I went walked 10 minutes from here to a supermarket, and one of the things I saw was M-Pesa Kenya written there. You can also see Airtel, you can see multiple digital payment systems. But Kenya really was at the forefront, at least in this part of the world, of embracing digital payments. So maybe turning to you, talk us through how, what is M-Pesa, how did it come about, and how has it changed things in Kenya? Over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. M-Pesa is, it's a Kiswahili word. Pesa means money. So M-Pesa is M-Money. It was first launched in Kenya in 2007 by Safaricom. Safaricom is a telecom private company in Kenya. And with M-Pesa, users are able to send money. They're able to receive money at the comfort of wherever they are. They can also access other services such as saving services and also accessing loans. These facilities has actually enabled us to be able to transact easily. You can make payments using M-Pesa. And it has contributed a lot to inclusivity in the society, and particularly inclusion of the previously excluded groups, particularly the women, and those who could not access the formal financial banks because of either the charges, which were very high, or they had very little money that they could transact with in the bank. However, M-Pesa has really opened up, and currently it is the in thing in Kenya, and it has grown wider and extended to other countries such as Rwanda here, as our moderator has indicated. Recently, it's in Ethiopia, it's in Congo, it is in India, it is in several other countries, and it's continuing to spread around. The other issue is it has contributed to poverty alleviation in a way, because with M-Pesa services, you can actually access credit. You can invest in your businesses. Your customers can pay through M-Pesa. It has resulted in job creation, because there are people who have been able to open up small shops where the other users can actually come for M-Pesa services. It has also made it easier for the government to transact, particularly to reach out to communities that are affected by drought, for instance. Whenever there is the drought has stricken, the beneficiaries are able to receive payments through M-Pesa very quickly in a fast and very efficient way. Thank you.
Just a quick follow-up. I mean, what strikes me, from what I understand, M-Pesa, what's quite unusual about it was it actually started with 2G, like, with text-based payments, right? So it was before QR codes. And the other thing was that it took off organically, I understand. It was not a top-down, it was the opposite of a PayPal or something like that. It was really a bottom-up adoption by people. Could you speak a little bit about how that happened? And in those circumstances? You said it back in 2007?
Yes, actually when it began as 2G, but at the moment we are at 5G, and at first the public did not have access to even the handset to be able to access M-Pesa, and many people did not understand how to access. But with the expansion of the use of modern telecommunication equipment, we have people in the rural areas, including old women as much as our grandmothers, our parents, who are now actually have access to the gadget, and they can easily use the service. Learning how to use was a challenge, but over time, I think with the children having acquired the knowledge of how to use the M-Pesa, they're able to transit that knowledge to their parents back at home. Yeah.
Turn to Tariq Karim. Bangladesh has been a really exciting story. Its economy over the past decade or so has really boomed. It's become a major exporter and a manufacturing power in the region. But one of the other stories that perhaps gets less attention is regional integration. And again, Bangladesh was at the forefront of SAARC in 35, 40 years ago. But speak a little bit now about what are some of the interesting integration efforts underway. Again, we heard at an earlier panel today about how there is insufficient integration in places like Latin America and Africa. So maybe speak about the Bangladeshi experience.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Dhruv, for first having me here on this panel. If I had something to do with the title, I would have said pragmatic solutions for an uncertain future. I'm saying this deliberately because in South Asia, we have gone through idealistic solutions, and that was SAARC. We set out to try and do that in 1985 when the leaders got together. They had very idealistic goals of what they wanted to do, but they forbade crossing borders, people-to-people contact and such. You can't improve trade unless traders can meet and cross each other's borders. They left a lot of things out which would have enabled that to happen, but didn't. Subsequently, Bangladesh realized that they can't move forward just because SAARC is not going anywhere. And perhaps the way to go to have a different approach is go the sub-regional route. And we felt that the eastern part of South Asia, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal, constituted perhaps a grouping where you would be able to embark on meaningful cooperation, given a few things. One of the things we had to address was getting our relations with India right. And when we set about that, it started in 2009 when we fixed our borders, both maritime and land boundary, which enabled us to address other issues. That also enabled us to address the issue of drawing in Bhutan and Nepal into sub-regional cooperation framework. We arrived at a document for motor vehicles agreement, which would have allowed connectivity. Without connectivity, you can't have trade. They go hand in hand. And since then, we have made progress. It's not been smooth. The journey has never been expected to be smooth, but we have inched forward. We may have stalled at times, but we have inched forward. One of the things, and I draw on the metaphor of the lighthouse, that we aimed for early on in 2010, 2011, was we all realized that we were short of energy and power. Without that, you cannot drive your industrial growth and development. We have, in these 4 countries, at least 100 gigawatts of hydropower latent, untapped. If we could connect our grids and start an exchange program, it would happen. So I was very happy to note that just a couple of weeks ago, at the summit level, finally, the hurdles were cleared, and Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Dhakal of Nepal agreed that power would flow from Nepal, hydropower, through India to Bangladesh, and it could work the same way between India to Bangladesh and maybe from Bangladesh to elsewhere. So that would be really lighting up our industrial future and our development hopes. So that is something, and of course, if we can transition to green energy, we are also moving away from adding more carbon into the atmosphere. We're addressing issues of the environment and global warming. And there are areas we can all cooperate on. If we expand our cooperation beyond BBI and to BIMSTEC and BIMSTEC to BIMSTEC Plus. So I'll...
just because a lot of people in the audience may not be aware, BIMSTEC, a show of hands, how many people have heard of the group called BIMSTEC before, international organization? So a few people here, but it's not that well known. And yet it's an organization that has been around since the 1990s.
1997.
Yeah. It has a secretariat in Dhaka.
Yes.
And so speak a little bit maybe about how it started off, again, maybe with a bit more idealistic, a very broad-based mission, but to become more practical, it had to actually streamline a little bit.
Well, BIMSTEC started basically first as BISTEC, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, Thailand. And then Myanmar joined in, so it became BIMSTEC. But then there was another grouping formed in 1997, which was the South Asian Growth Quadrangle. That was basically the earlier incarnation of BBIN, which is Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal. That didn't get off the ground. BIMSTEC showed some more promise, started moving a little bit. They identified, again, very ambitious, 18 areas of cooperation. And not much really happened in the 18 areas in 20 years until finally, after the secretariat was established, because it had a moving secretariat. It was a permanent secretariat established, and then, goalposts were set. And I think recently the summit, not long ago, I think in 2021, 22, decided on a course of action, which would include connectivity across the Bay of Bengal waters, and also various other things related to tackling climate change and global warming. Incidentally, when Bhutan and Nepal also said that what is our fault? Why haven't we been included? We were in SAGQ. They also joined a few months later. And then it was a challenge having to add 2 more consonants to that BIMSTEC, which stood for Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Thailand, economic cooperation. So inventively and ingeniously, it was called Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral, Technical, and Economic Cooperation. But
you kept the acronym, but changed the...
Yeah. So, but it is not Bay of Bengal configuration entirely, because it still leaves out Malaysia and Indonesia. Bay of Bengal, incidentally, is the gateway from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific through the Malacca Straits. So those 2 countries, I hope, will come in at some point of time, and it'll become meaningful.
But it's an interesting example of how, when we talk about practical cooperation, how sometimes, again, you start off with very grand objectives, but sometimes practical cooperation means doing less, but doing it better. If I can turn to Arvind Gupta, and switching gear a little bit, we've heard, again, different, over the past day or so, different examples of what India is doing, digital public infrastructure and so forth, on the job, the gig economy. But you, from personal experience, you worked in California, you worked in Silicon Valley, you came back to India. Tell us a little bit about the startup ecosystem and what are both some of the challenges and the opportunities that you experienced firsthand.
Thank you, Dhruva. I'll address the startup thing, but one thing very important you'll hear from the global south is one common theme always, I think. Why the success stories have been successful? Because they've started, as you rightly use the word, bottom up. Whether it's the M-Pesa example, the adoption is really bottom up, it's not top down. And that's really the story that whether it's the DPI, the digital public infrastructure story in India, and then pivoting into the startup world. Why that is important is the startups, generally I've always said, the Silicon Valley startups solve for the top billion of the world. The startups in India are solving for the next 6 billion. And that is based on very, very bottom-up, frugal innovation, based on very low value transactions, but higher volume transactions. And that is also derived for the fact that you have given them consumers who have an identity. Everybody in India has an identity, which is the Aadhaar, as we call it in India. Everybody has access to payments and banking. 2014, probably about 40% of Indians have access to banking. Today, 100% at a household level have access to banking. And banking does not mean just a payment system, but real bank accounts which hold money. They can get interest, they can invest money. And thirdly, you have given them skills, which is starting from basic digital literacy to train them enough to do transactions and do things. These are the ingredients on top of which startups succeed, because that's how they can make frictionless transactions, do frictionless experience to the consumer. So, from having, and then the government put its might in 2016 to launch a very directed program towards startups, to focus on policy, which is the mindset issue, the second M of setting up a national startup fund dedicated to funding Indian startups. 3, setting up a separate policy where the government itself would buy 5 to 10% of products from startups, registered startups. And fourthly, set up a mentorship program of successful people across the country who could help other startups, the 4 M's, essential ingredients for startups. The Prime Minister visited Silicon Valley in September 2015, and we launched the Startup India program in January 16, 2016. So within a matter of 3 months, we had the program up and running. And the resultant of that has been that last year, India added a unicorn a week, sometimes 2. A unicorn is a company worth $1 billion, valued at $1 billion. And today, India has about 120 unicorns. Last year, we attracted about $26 billion of venture capital in India, second only to the US, but actually much higher because $1 in India goes about 10x more than $1 in the US. And we have now 85,000, 86,000 startups and counting. Just the sheer number of startups make it, the probability of higher unicorns coming out every year much higher. So it's a very different approach, as I explained. It's actually a 180-degree difference. Top down, solve for the top Silicon Valley approach, solve for the bottom of the pyramid, the large volume. And India, if you don't scale up and if you don't have numbers equivalent to, and sometimes as a venture capitalist, people come and say, oh, I'm addressing 2% of the population. But if you think about it, 2% of the population in India is over 20 million people. And that's a lot of consumers. So if you're not scaling up at that level, you're really not successful. So the experience in India is very different. And it's actually, this whole experience has shifted in a very, very positive note in the last 5-6 years. It was not that positive before because we have given them, as I said, the consumers, the markets, the mindset change, also the money. There's a lot of money that is available in India to startups now. And lastly, it has become, and I was joking about it yesterday on the panel, it has now become cool to be part of startups for the younger generation. And whatever the definition of young is, and that keeps changing. But that is, it is something that is okay. And people fail and say, I've done 2 startups, I've not succeeded. And that's the mindset change that it's okay to fail has also helped a lot. But the biggest lesson that is different from India, the digital public infrastructure has given them the foundational layer on top of which startups are able to build with less friction. Consumers, they're able to deal with less friction because they can easily do payments, and they have the skills and the identity that already exists. So the onboarding experience is very good. I'll just give one last very interesting anecdote. About 2017-18, I was back in Silicon Valley. I had a group of companies. One of them was CEO of the company that you named, PayPal. And it was a room like this, and I gave an open challenge. I said, if anybody can onboard a customer faster than I can open a bank account, I will personally give a check to any of you Silicon Valley companies. The fastest they could do onboard a customer onto their platform was 4 minutes. We opened a bank account in less than 1 minute, 55 seconds actually, sitting in Silicon Valley, because we could do the digital identity and everything was digital onboarding. So that experience has changed the startup experience in India.
2 quick questions. One, do you think you'd give an example of an Indian startup that does what you described, which is sort of cater to the next 6 billion, that has done something that really, that a Silicon Valley company couldn't do? What would you, give 1 or 2 examples of sort of what is an archetype of a Indian startup? And secondly, to play devil's advocate a little bit, one of the criticisms is that you have sometimes high valuation of startups, a lot of money thrown in at the first stage, second stage. They become unicorns, but then sustaining that, at some stage there's a gap between their revenue stream and their revenue model and their valuations, which leads to a bit of a slump. How do you get over that slump in some ways? Or is that just part of the business?
So I'll give you an example of a startup in India, which is the LinkedIn for the poor, I call it, in a way, because it's aggregating jobs. And these are people who actually, and there's one startup sitting here, and disclaimer, it is somebody I know very well, Amish Shukla, I don't know whether he is. I can give examples like this, many examples. But let me first start with this LinkedIn for the everyday workers. They actually don't have a LinkedIn for themselves. They can't go and type somewhere, these are my skills, and a marketplace. So somebody has set up, a startup has set up a phone-based system. They call in they call in and put in their skills. They talk about their skills. What is that they're able to do, or what are their skills? And then on the back end, it gets translated into a profile for them based on their phone number. And their skills and the location that they're based, they get an SMS message every day morning that people are looking for this kind of daily jobs in your region, and this is the kind of pay they will pay you. So they have a choice. So it really creates a new marketplace for them and enables them to go and find a job or apply to a job or go and do jobs which they were earlier not getting. And also it has removed the middleman who was aggregating them previously, the contractor, as we know the word. So now this kind of a model wouldn't exist in Silicon Valley. They don't have this problem. We have it. So, there is Easy Gov sitting somewhere here. I don't know, Amit is still here. What does he do? He uses AI and ML, and we use this technology in the government. As a disclaimer, I used him as a test case. We have about 330 central schemes, benefit programs, welfare programs, that people don't know. They don't have a Google to search which benefit they're eligible for. And you leave out people of availing for a benefit or a scheme that they are actually eligible for because they don't know whether they're first of all eligible or not, and then how to get that, how to fill the paperwork. Companies like EasyGov help them discover their eligibility. So they, based on a certain criteria, questionnaire, and then say, hey, you are eligible for these 5 schemes of the government. Click on these few buttons and apply. So these are very different business models, and they do well. On your second question, valuation is a myth. Even though I use the word unicorns, and maybe we have to start correcting ourselves. Unicorns are people who, I would try to say, who reach 50 million to 100 million. But the world measures you from the valuation and unicorn perspective that way. That's why we kind of get used to that. And it's a hype curve. There is a hype curve that happens. Valuations do go up and down. I mean, we've had certain companies in India, without taking names, which are valued at 20 billion and now are down to 6 billion and 8 billion. I think this is also to do with some of the, if you heard the panel last night, where people from Silicon Valley who are venture capitalists were talking about it. It's, the valuations are hyped because they want to show an exit at a higher value. So there is also a I scratch your back, you scratch my back phenomena that happens there. But real sustainable startups will be the ones which have solid cash flows. We've had very good, so the proof of the pudding also lies in their listing. We have had startups, we actually had to modify the policy for listing. Like NASDAQ has a policy for listing where you could not be profitable and still get listed. In India, the listing policy for a stock listing used to be that it had to be profitable for a certain number of years. So we had to modify that. But once we've done that, I think we are seeing a lot of startups getting listed. The real valuation is getting discovered there. So, but yeah, valuation is an up and down game. While it's good to have that as a parameter, it's sometimes not the right parameter always.
Deborah, turning to you, you come from the United States. The projects your institution, and we'd love to hear more about the work you do, focus on the developed world rather than developing world. But a lot of the issues you work on are equally applicable: climate resilience, sustainable urbanization, and things like that. So speak maybe a little bit about how you moved from academia and sort of started putting some of that into practice.
Great question.
And what are some of the lessons?
First with, I think what's common around this panel is how we think about innovation. And fundamentally for us, it starts with the problem. It's a dissatisfaction with the status quo. Something is not working in the status quo, and we need to improve upon it. And where we see inclusive innovation is increasing access and opportunities for everyone to innovate, but that innovation isn't the end state. It's not just you innovate to innovate. It's a way to drive shared economic prosperity. And behind our work is understanding that there's a huge inequality, even in the U.S., right? You consider it as developed, but there's a lot of inequality from rural to urban, intra-urban, et cetera. And so we approach innovation with the understanding that, one, we need to address the problem, and two, how do we address the problem by empowering the locality to be part of the solution? And so how we think about innovation is, one, we want to lower the barriers to entry for who can innovate. The previous panel talked a lot about women and the equity there. I think in the startup world is a very common theme. At the end of the day, who are the startups? Who are the VC? Who gets access to capital? Who gets access to social capital? There's a huge disparity on that. And so we want to lower the barriers to entry on who can innovate, one. Two, how they innovate. It's not definitely just a linear path or a sequential path. And then three, why they innovate. In our minds, you can innovate for good and well simultaneously. It doesn't need to be mutually exclusive. And I think that's a difference between just startups with that profit and just the broader entrepreneurial ecosystem. And what I mean by that, it means it includes small businesses. It means, people who are in the research, and it widens the pool on who can be part of the solution and who can be part of innovation. And I'll give you just one concrete example, if I may. We have a whole agricultural technology portfolio. And agriculture is actually one of the largest industries in Georgia and actually parts of the US. You may not know that. But for agriculture, a lot of the agricultural technology is focused on large industrial-sized farming. When actually a majority of the farmers are small and medium-sized producers. Sound familiar? It's everywhere. And so how do we empower small and medium-sized producers with precision agriculture? Meaning, how do they get empowered by understanding sensor data to collect water conservation, soil conservation? How can they be empowered in terms of rotation of crops, et cetera? So we actually built this online module to focus on digital literacy training for small and medium-sized producers, so that they can be empowered for this. It started with 2 universities. We are now talking to, the private sector to see what other technology they can add into it. And then it becomes a greater public-private partnership. So, how can we include something that might start in the research end and then pull the public sector in, whether it's local government or federal government or national, international government? How can we pull the private sector in and collectively innovate for something that addresses the problem around agriculture?
Quick question on that example, and I suspect, again, that's an example that will resonate with a lot of people here, which is digital literacy for farmers and agricultural workers. What is the, and given particularly this coming from universities, these are not degree granting programs or anything like that. What is the time frame you look at and who bears the cost for it? And how do you show success? I mean, is it in terms of crop yields? What do you use as a metric for success?
Yeah, great question. Great questions. So absolutely, it's based on the needs of the small and medium-sized producers first. So we actually did some extensive surveys in terms of where they are, their baselines are, and understanding agricultural technology, what they actually need in terms of their seasons and crop rotations, and then we formulate the training based on that. So it's very much driven with value in mind. So the outcome we are measuring is their quality of life going to improve because they are able to, get greater yields, but also there's a sustainability component that we're tracking. At the end of the day, are we sensitive to the environment? Are we protecting the environment based on those needs? There's a lot of land that we have been discovering that's being agricultural land that's being sold for development at risk. And that fundamentally is a huge risk for us. And so another project that we've done is called the Work and Farm Fund, and it actually purchases agricultural land that will be sold to development at risk, purchases it, and then repurposes it for providing additional capital and training for next generation farmers so that they actually can own the land, and then has guaranteed contracts from universities and hospitals to buy the produce from those farmers so they have an end-to-end solution in terms of land acquisition and conservation, next generation farmer training, and then farm-to-table nutrition.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes, less than 15 minutes for questions. If people want to ask, I mean, we touched upon a different set of issues, but again, there's a common theme running through all of them. So I have many questions, so if people don't start. I might just come back. Oh, do we have one here? Ashok? Oh, no, I'm sorry. I have a few that I might take around, but if people could line up here, we can maybe take a few questions from the audience before. I realize we're standing between all of you and dinner, but one of the things, maybe start with Deborah here. We can go in reverse order. If you were to say, what are some of the, it seems in some ways quite obvious when you have successful cases that they should be very easily replicable. What, to give your example, have you seen are other technical universities adopting similar approaches? Do you have, lessons learned? Do you share lessons learned with your counterparts, not just in the US, but in other countries? Has there been interest?
Yes, and we have started to replicate it in other communities, and most of the projects that we do have that in mind in terms of scale and model. But I think it's important to note that we never want to helicopter in and say, this is the best approach or this is the best idea. It's really important that it's embraced by the locality, wherever that community is, with the common understanding that this is a common problem. So again, you always have to start with a problem and then understand the needs of that locality before you just go in and say, this is the solution. We're very mindful of that, and a lot of it starts with discussions and understanding.
Another sort of similar challenge, and when we talk about sort of a technology that started with a certain, was enabled by a certain set of digital technologies. In the case of Kenya, it was again 2G phones. today now when you have much, 5G coming in, do you see that as a challenge, in some ways disrupting earlier technologies that people have become accustomed to? Or are people very quick to evolve into new and adopt new technologies that become available?
Okay, what I can say is that it's not really a challenge, particularly in the urban areas. However, in the rural areas, it's a challenge because of the limitations in terms of access to the internet to be able to access the 5G. However, they're still able to access and utilize the services for M-Pesa. Yeah.
Arvind, again, with the startup ecosystem, again, you do have so two kinds of questions. So one is, India is in some ways unusual in that it's a very large market, right? And one of the things I hear from people in Africa and Southeast Asia and others is sort of, we have a similar business model, but this doesn't make sense for a country of 10 or 20 million people. As you said, that's a small part of the Indian market. What are do you see the kind of startups catering sometimes to very hyper-local, what in India would be considered hyper-local problems? And do you see those replicable in other places?
So Dhruva, a couple of things. First, let me just add on to what you asked Nancy from technology perspective. All successful startups or startups which are bottom-up are mindful of one thing. They always make sure that the lowest end of the consumer is still served. And when I say that, it means is that even though you may have 4G, 5G, but your 2G customer is still to be served, because there is still a lot of people who are still using 2G or have got accustomed to that. So, a good technology always keeps supporting, especially if it's a bottom-up technology or a startup. And we've seen this, for example, in the payment system in India. Many people don't know the payment system in India actually can work on a non-smartphone. As a *99 hash, a USSD connection can still enable a payment to happen. And people still use that. Of course, the proportion that, if 5% people used to use it, now it's 0.5%, but we don't want to leave anyone behind. So that 0.5% still gets served and that service still is active. The question of, scale and hyper-local, what people have realized, and big startups from the US or from China. Chinese startups don't work in India, by the way. Chinese technology doesn't work in India. India has banned all Chinese platforms and technology. So we don't have any Chinese technology or platforms in India. But the Silicon Valley companies which operate in India have realized that cut and paste doesn't work. The copy and paste model, it kind of is good to start with that, but they had to adopt. One of the most popular ride-sharing companies, actually pre-demonetization or the popularity of payments in India, it had to innovate, and that is Uber, by the way. The first country they offered cash as a payment option was India way back in 2013 and 14, because they realized that digital payments were not pervasive. Today, that option is, of course, dead and gone, but there was a time that was the most prevalent option, and they had to do that. Cash on delivery, Amazon had to do, which is a new concept in the US, because there was nobody giving cash on delivery to the courier person who was getting your Amazon e-commerce goods to your home. So cut and paste doesn't work, whether it's Indian startup going to, and there are a lot of Indian startups now expanding, failing overseas markets. They're super successful in India. So that doesn't work anyway.
I remember Zomato coming into North America with a bit of fanfare.
Ola tried it, Zomato tried it, and there is a lesson in it themselves. You have to understand the local dynamics, which I think Deborah and Nancy and everybody has said. If you don't do that and you try to helicopter in, you will fail, and that applies to Indian startups expanding to any other region. But there are a lot of successful startups which are saying that if you can operate at that scale and at that margin level, a very low margin level, then you have a potential to expand into other markets, learn from those markets, localize for those markets, and do it. So that's definitely the case. But the only thing is, if you can in India, the lesson that you learn is that if you can operate at much lower cost, then you can only go up from there. And that is the frugality of innovation that the Indian startup ecosystem has.
Well, I hope all the people who took part in the entrepreneurship boot camp over the last few days, if there's some of you in the room, that you're all taking notes from what we've heard speakers talk about. Tariq Karim, we've been talking, when you talk about sub-regional connectivity, again, whether in South Asia, Southeast Asia, whether it's in West Africa, Latin America, we talk about issues that can be dealt with at the government level often, like high politics, infrastructure, connectivity, you spoke about that, cross-border energy flows, road and rail connectivity. How much of an emphasis should there be, or is there, of the kinds of issues that some of the other panelists have brought up, which is sort of lessons learned, bringing together entrepreneurs from those places, bringing together cross-border, cash flows. How much of that do you anticipate that becoming more prevalent on subnational agendas?
See, in the national level, within Bangladesh itself, and also in the other countries I mentioned, Nepal, Bhutan, startups have been happening. They have been taking place, particularly with the shock given by COVID when everything shut down. There was a proliferation of startups at home level or very small level, which took off. And because we had embarked on a process of digitization within Bangladesh, transactions have become increasingly more and more digital. Problem is cross-border transfer of transactions taking place. And this was a problem which was faced, which still is to some extent. For example, we started this concept of border hearts between India and Bangladesh. Along the borders, we had, there used to be a traditional market before the partition that seized, and we said, why don't we renew this, revive this, have these local communities on two sides of the fence come together and exchange the products, etc. But the question was, how are they going to do the transaction, the financial transaction? There were lots of barriers to that. I think gradually we are overcoming those challenges. We are also transitioning towards digital transactions in that. The banking systems have to do a bit of more coordination between themselves.
Well, thank you. As I said, please join me in thanking the panel, and I have a quick announcement after that.